How do you summarize a life that began in a tiny log cabin in the mountains of Tennessee, rose to the highest levels of global entertainment, and yet remained deeply connected to the faith and music of home? Welcome to Gospel Music Today with Toll Music. Today, we're going to pause from our usual programming to remember, celebrate, and reflect on the extraordinary life, music, faith, and legacy of one of the world's most recognizable entertainers, Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton died today, August 25, 2026, at the age of 80. And I know some of you may be wondering, Dr. T, this is Gospel Music Today. Why are we dedicating an episode to Dolly Parton? That's a fair question. Because when many people hear the name Dolly Parton, they immediately think of country music. They think of the big blonde hair, the rhinestones. Jolene, 9 to 5, I Will Always Love You. They may think of Hollywood, Dollywood, and one of the most recognizable personalities in American entertainment. But there is another part of Dolly's story that is important for us to remember: her faith. And this isn't something that appeared late in her career. It goes all the way back to her childhood. Dolly Parton was born in Pittman Center, Tennessee, and raised in a one-room cabin at Locust Ridge in the Great Smoky Mountains of Sevier County, Tennessee. She was the fourth of 12 children born to Robert Lee and Avie Lee Parton. Her family was poor, very poor. The family lived in a small log cabin without electricity or running water. But while the Parton family may not have had much materially, they had something that would become enormously important to Dolly's life: music and faith. Her mother, Avie Lee, sang to the children and taught Dolly church music as well as traditional mountain ballads. And Dolly's grandfather, Reverend Jake Robert Owens, was a Pentecostal preacher and musician. So, church music wasn't something Dolly discovered after she became famous. It was part of the environment that formed her. That Appalachian and Pentecostal musical tradition became part of the sound that eventually made her famous. And you can hear it. That distinctive voice, that tremble, that emotional delivery, that ability to move from almost a whisper to a powerful high note. Dolly didn't simply become a country singer. She carried the sound of the mountains with her. And she started very young. By the age of 10, she was already performing on local television and radio around Knoxville. At 13, she made her debut at the Grand Ole Opry, where Johnny Cash introduced her. And after graduating from high school in 1964, Dolly moved to Nashville. She was 18 years old. She arrived in Music City with a cardboard suitcase and a dream. And what happened next became one of the most remarkable careers in the history of popular music. Dolly became a songwriter, a singer, an actress, a businesswoman, a producer, and eventually, a global cultural icon. She wrote thousands of songs, including some of the most recognizable songs in popular music: Jolene, Coat of Many Colors, I Will Always Love You, 9 to 5, and she became successful across country, pop, bluegrass, film, television, and musical theater. But here's what is particularly interesting for gospel music today. Dolly never completely separated herself from the gospel music that shaped her childhood. She continued to record gospel music throughout her career, and sometimes she brought that gospel right into the mainstream. Take He's Alive. The song was written by Christian songwriter Don Francisco, but Dolly's recording became one of her most memorable gospel performances. And in 1989, she performed He's Alive at the CMA Awards, backed by a 100-member choir, on a nationally televised broadcast. Think about that. One of the biggest country music stages in America. And Dolly Parton is standing there singing about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That performance tells you something about the place gospel music occupied in her artistic life. Then there is Coat of Many Colors. Now, I want to be careful with this one. It is not a Bible story. It is Dolly telling the story of her own childhood. Her mother made her a coat from pieces of fabric because the family couldn't afford to buy her one. Other children mocked her because of it. But Dolly transformed that experience into a song about poverty, love, gratitude, and the idea that material wealth isn't the same thing as being rich. And the biblical imagery of Joseph's coat is there in the background. So even in one of her most famous country songs, you can hear the spiritual world that shaped her thinking. Then there are songs like Daddy Was an Old-Time Preacher Man, which Dolly co-wrote with her aunt Dorothy Jo Hope. The song is deeply connected to the family and church world she knew growing up. And this is something I think is easy to miss about Dolly. Her faith wasn't simply a category of music. It was part of her vocabulary for understanding life. And you see that again much later in her career. In 2019, Dolly recorded There Was Jesus with Christian artist Zach Williams. The song became a major Christian music success and won the Grammy for Best Contemporary Christian Music Performance song. And then there was her collaboration with For King and Country on God Only Knows. Again, Dolly stepped into contemporary Christian music and used her voice to communicate a message of hope to people dealing with loneliness, pain, and difficult seasons. So, yes, Dolly Parton was the queen of country music, but she was also an artist who never completely abandoned the musical and spiritual language that formed her. And then there is another part of Dolly's legacy that I think deserves our attention, her generosity. Because Dolly didn't simply talk about caring for people, she built institutions around it. In 1995, she launched the Imagination Library, inspired in part by her father, who could not read or write. The program provides free, age-appropriate books to children from birth to age 5, and it has grown far beyond Tennessee. By 2026, the Imagination Library had gifted more than 325 million books to children across the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and the Republic of Ireland. That's not just a charitable project, that's a legacy. And Dolly's generosity wasn't limited to literacy. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she donated $1 million to Vanderbilt University Medical Center to support COVID-19 research. That funding supported important research, including work connected to the early clinical development of Moderna's mRNA vaccine. And in 2022, she gave another $1 million to Vanderbilt for pediatric infectious disease research. Then we have the devastating wildfires that struck the Great Smoky Mountains region in 2016. This was Dolly's home, her community, and she responded by creating the My People Fund, which provided financial assistance to families who had lost homes in the fires. The fund ultimately helped more than 900 families, providing $1,000 a month for 6 months. Again, you see the same pattern. She had been blessed, and she used that blessing to bless somebody else. And perhaps that is one of the most interesting things about Dolly Parton's life. She became extraordinarily wealthy and extraordinarily famous. But she never stopped talking about where she came from. The little girl from the Tennessee mountains remained part of the woman who became a global icon. And maybe that's one reason Dolly connected with so many different kinds of people. She could walk into a room with billionaires and still talk like the girl from East Tennessee. She could stand on a massive stage and still sing songs about her mother, her father, her childhood, her faith, and the people she loved. She could become one of the most successful entertainers in the world and still make generosity part of her public legacy. For those of us looking at her life from a Christian perspective, I think there is something worth reflecting on. What do we do with what God has given us? Talent is a gift. Opportunity is a gift. Influence is a gift. Money is a gift. And the question is not simply how much we accumulate. The question is, what do we do with it? Dolly Parton's life gives us a very visible example of someone who used her platform to create music, build businesses, support education, fund medical research, and help people in difficult circumstances. And while we should be careful not to turn a person's life into a perfect Christian testimony, because none of us knows another person's heart completely, we can still recognize the very visible role that faith, family, music, and generosity played in Dolly's story. And there is something else worth remembering. Dolly Parton wasn't perfect. She wasn't simply a Christian artist operating inside the Christian music industry. She was a complicated, enormously successful cultural figure who worked across secular entertainment, country music, gospel, film, business, and philanthropy. And perhaps that is exactly why her story is worth discussing here. Because sometimes the influence of faith isn't seen only in the songs that are labeled gospel. Sometimes you hear it in the values, in the stories, in the compassion, in the way someone remembers where they came from, and in the way they choose to use influence. Dolly once sang about the simple things that made life meaningful. And perhaps, when you look at her life as a whole, that simplicity is part of the story. A girl from the mountains, a family that didn't have much, a mother who sang, a preacher grandfather, a young woman who came to Nashville with a dream. And then, the world opened up. Millions of records, movies, awards, businesses, theme parks, books, charity, and a catalog of songs that will probably outlive all of us. Today, the world is mourning Dolly Parton. Country music is mourning. Nashville is mourning. The entertainment world is mourning, and many Christians are also reflecting on the faith and gospel music that were such an important part of her story. So perhaps the best way for gospel music today, with tall music, to remember Dolly, is not simply to say goodbye to a country music legend. It is to remember the little girl who learned to sing in the mountains, the songwriter who never forgot her roots, and the woman who used an extraordinary platform to give millions of people something beyond entertainment. Thank you, Dolly. Thank you for the music. Thank you for the stories. Thank you for the laughter. Thank you for the generosity. And thank you for reminding the world that where you start does not have to determine how far your story can go. This has been Gospel Music Today with Toll Music. I'm Dr. T.